Howdy folks, today we're going to be looking at the Colt Single Action Army. Now Simran recently sent me these beautiful pistols to do a video on, but before I could make a video about these clones of the Single Action Army, I figured I needed to get a little bit more intimate with the original Colt Single Action Army. So I contacted a local gun store owner and gun collector named Ron Peterson, who's been collecting guns for longer than I've been alive. The original plan was to show up, have him show me a Colt Single Action Army. We'd take a look and see if anything was different about that gun compared to these clones, but Ron had other ideas. Instead, he brought his entire collection of Colt Single Action Armies that he had laying around the house. These weren't the guns that he also had in a museum. The pistols range from original Army models adopted by the US cavalry to custom engraved pearl-handled pieces carried by wealthy farmers, all the way to modern Generation 3 Colt Single Action Armies that were gifted to Oscar award-winning celebrities. So it is quite the collection. If you are interested in the Colt Single Action Army, an iconic firearm and an incredible piece of Americana, stay tuned, because this is the history of the Colt Single Action Army in one man's collection. Today we're here with Ron Peterson, who has been collecting guns for what, about
55, 60 years.
Yeah, so I figured I'd turn to an expert to learn a little bit more about the history of the Colt Single Action Army. So why don't you take it away?
All right. The Colt Single Action was the first true cartridge revolver designed by the Colt Company. It was introduced in 1873. They made maybe one or two guns, and in 1874 they made 200, and then in 1875 the U.S. government bought this gun right here, 15,000 of them. So between 1875 and 1891 the federal government brought over 36,000 of these guns. There were, starting in 1877, a lot of single action guns were also in the civilian market. This looks exactly like the same gun. The only difference is it doesn't have the little US mark on the side of the frame. This is a gun that was carried by a local sheriff here in Albuquerque in the late 1870s and 1880s. It's along with its original holster and belt. Only difference in the gun is the same caliber, the US marking on the frame. There were competitors of the gun. The government also adopted the Smith & Wesson Schofield, and that's the term that was used for a long time, long Colt, because the Schofield used a shorter 45 cartridge. This is a Remington example. They made them from 1875 to about 1893. This is early Smith & Wesson, made in the 1870s. And then this is a Merwin and Hulbert, which was made by Hopkins and Allen in the 1870s and 1880s. This is a very fancy example with carved Mexican eagle ivory grips.
I wanted to ask you a question real quick. If there's so many competitors to the Colt Single Action Army, why was the Colt Single Action Army so well known?
Because of the movies. Before television, young people like myself, every Saturday afternoon we went to see the movies. It cost a dime or a quarter. And of course, in the movies, everybody used a Colt Single Action. So that became the standard for people like me who grew up without television and everything else. It was a Colt Single Action was a gun. By 1900, most of these guns had been eliminated, and Colt was the only true manufacturer of single action style guns.
Wow. What, as far as numbers of manufacture go, was the Colt Single Action the most popular? Or?
Oh, yes, by far the most popular. Made 357,000 of them between 1874 and 1940. And the other guns were made in much smaller numbers, and by, like I say, by 1900 they were mostly all gone.
Wow. Okay. So where does that bring us?
All right. The Colt Single Action remained in a black powder style with this kind of a screw holding the cylinder pin in from the 1870s up until 1896 or 97, and the guns were then changed, and the first gun introduced with what we call a cross pin, which was the remainder of production, as a pin goes crossways like this, takes the cylinder pin out, was the Colt Bisley. And the Colt Bisley was first introduced like this as a target model in 1895. By 1896 or 97, they also started making Bisleys in a more conventional style, and they manufactured them up until 1912. This is a standard Bisley made in 1912. And this also has a scarce pair of grips because right at the end of production of Bisleys, Colt also started putting medallions in their grips. So this gun is in new condition, made in 1912, with special grips with a medallion.
Wow. Man, it's a beautiful finish on this too. I don't know if you can see that there, but this case hardening is just gorgeous. I'd like to take a brief break to mention our sponsors. Ventura Munitions, one of the best places online to buy ammunition, and Top Gun Supply. They are an online sport shooting superstore. Now, back to our regularly scheduled content.
By the mid-1880s, Colt had stopped producing guns except on special order with one-piece wooden grips and came up with this Eagle-style black hard rubber grip, which stayed in production until the late 1890s. And this is also a black powder gun, and as the time went on, the barrel length of the guns generally tended to decrease. This is the shortest barrel that was factory made with an ejector rod.
Wow. What is the finish on this?
That gun is just well worn.
Okay.
That gun's had a hard life.
Wow. So they originally, what was most common for barrel lengths when they first came out?
The first guns were all 7.5-inch barrels like this. As the style changed, most people wore the gun either backwards or backwards like this when they rode a horse. As the style changed where they rode the holster on this side, then the barrel length tended to decrease. A lot of guns were cut off.
Okay.
Actually used in a holster worn with the gun butt rearward on your side like this.
Wow. So that was a kind of common modification at the time?
That's a factory modified, or lots of hacksaws were used.
I know that the original gun was, what, 7-inch barrel?
7.5-inch.
And then they switched the artillery model, which they had sent back to Colt, to cut the barrel length down?
When the Rough Riders went to Cuba, they took these Colt and modified them to this barrel length, 5.5-inch barrels. So in 1897, they modified a few hundred of them for the Rough Riders, and then in 1903, during the Philippine insurrection, the government took thousands and thousands of these guns and converted them to the 5.5-inch barrel length to use in the Philippines.
Man.
Okay. So early on, by 1877 or 1878, Winchester decided to build a lever action rifle. Well, actually, it started in 1873, and then Colt decided to build a pistol in the same caliber as a rifle, so you could buy a rifle or a pistol in the same caliber. This is a model 1873 Winchester. The gun that won the West was made in 44-40, 38-40, and 32-20. And Colt made companion pistols in all three calibers to match your rifle, so you could have a rifle and a handgun in the same cartridge. It was very popular.
Now, why didn't Winchester just release their rifle in 45 Colt or long Colt or?
Because the design of the rifle didn't lend itself to feeding a straight-walled case. It had to have a slight taper to the case.
Okay.
So that's how come and 44-40 in the late 1870s, 1880s, and 1890s was probably the most popular cartridge. By 1900, things began to change, and people didn't need to have the big, heavy cartridges as much. So from 1900 until the end of production, the actual small little 32-20 became the most popular caliber.
Huh. Sounds like kind of an anemic round. You know?
Well, it's much less powerful for sure.
Okay.
Very, very similar to a 30M1 carbine cartridge.
Okay.
All right. Let's see what else I got here. Here in New Mexico, was quite popular on especially the Navajo reservation. to have special grips made out of pearl or ivory. This is a very rare pair of grips that was made. This gun was actually shipped onto the Navajo reservation. Has a ram's horn pearl grip on it. That's a very unusual, very different kind of a pearl grip. And guns can also have, single actions can have a lot of history. And history adds greatly to the value of their gun. This gun was actually modified from a longer barrel to a 5-inch barrel, which was not a Colt length, by a gunsmith in Denver named A.W. Peterson, no relation. And he had a gunsmith shop on Larimer Street in Denver. He was held up one day, robbed. The robber ran out and started running down Larimer Street on the trolley tracks. Mr. Peterson was an excellent shot. He went out, stood there, and shot the man in the back of the head running away. He was acquitted. Okay.
And this is the gun?
This is the gun.
Wow.
Okay. So there are lots of stories with lots of single actions.
Wow. And so he customized this himself?
He cut the barrel down to make it shorter, put a different, thicker, little bigger front sight on it. Yeah.
What caliber is this in, or cartridges? 44? Smith & Wesson?
This is in 44 Special, which was a cartridge that was introduced by Smith & Wesson in the early 1900s. That's a fairly scarce caliber in a Colt single action.
It's got a body on it. That's cool.
About 1% of the Colt single actions made before 1940, or a couple thousand guns, were engraved at the Colt factory. In the 1880s, when the train came to Albuquerque, a man named A.J. Post set up a gun shop here in Albuquerque, and quite a few very fancy guns were shipped to this area. Both of these single actions I have here were shipped here to Albuquerque. This one for a man in Clifton, Arizona, has his name on the back strap. You can see it has a bullhead carved in very fancy pearl grips, factory engraved. And this gun was shipped to the same Mr. A.J. Post for a man named Don Alberto, who was a sheep farmer, or a sheep rancher in eastern central New Mexico. Had a very large sheep ranch. That's the holster he had. This gun is in 4440, which is the same as a Winchester 73. Highly engraved. It's got his initials here. Only grip I've ever seen with a U sheep carved in the grip. Okay. Again, factory engraved.
And those were all engraved by hand at the factory?
Engraved by hand at the factory, special order guns. Yeah. They're quite scarce.
And we'll have to show this later, get a close-up shot of this, but the engraving is completely different on the two of them.
Well, I mean, similar but different, yes.
I mean, so they've got on the, just this is different.
Yeah, just different on the loading gate and stuff. Oh yeah, the styles were different. The amount of coverage, these are two different barrel lengths, but the amount of coverage on both of these guns is about the same. That's a great deal of coverage. A lot of guns didn't have quite that much engraving on them.
How much would those cost back then?
A regular single action at the time, let's say around 1900, a regular single action would have been less than $20. A gun like this might cost $75 or $100.
Wow, and how much are they worth today?
In the $20,000 range.
Those are good investment to buy an engraved gun back then.
Well, might be, yes. Okay. All right.
Wow.
Now, there are engravers that work today who still copy that style of engraving. Here's a Colt Bisley, engraved by my friend Ben Lane, who's probably the best copier of the original factory scroll engraving. This is a Bisley with ivory grips, beautifully engraved, very similar in style to the engraving on these Colt pistols. And then this is another one engraved, but this one's been modified. This was the famous Elmer Keith came up with this design. It's a Colt single action trigger guard with a modified Bisley backstrap, so you can see the grip is smaller. Okay, makes a totally different feel out, and they didn't use a Bisley hammer. They used a Bisley or a single action frame to build the gun. This gun was also engraved by Ben Lane, and for a copy of fancy factory grips.
So these are modern. This one's modern made.
This gun was done in the 1960s. This gun was done in the 1970s.
Okay. Wow. Man, they're beautiful.
My favorite Colt single action grips with a medallion and this fancy checkering. This gun belonged to an early silent film star, William S. Hart.
Wow.
Okay. This is the thing that made the single actions famous, was because of film stars. He actually used mostly double actions in his movie, but this was his personal gun. Today we have a very popular gun called the Colt Python that lends its barrel design from a guy named King in California, who designed this add-on rib to a Colt single action to make it a target type pistol. This is one of the 500 357 Colt single actions they made. Again, it has these grips on it, has this added rib, has a different kind of a hammer with a shorter throw, a wider trigger, made as a target pistol.
When were these produced?
In the late 1930s.
So this is where the Python came from.
Well, the design
yeah,
of the rib for the Python came from that idea.
Which is pretty iconic to the Python.
Right,
I didn't know.
absolutely. It is the thing for the...
Wow, this has got a interesting trigger on it as well.
Right, yes. Works.
Yeah. Let's see.
I have a lot of other guns that are in a museum in Santa Fe that I don't have here today that were used by famous people, but this gun was a single action made in the 1920s for a man named Oliver Lafarge, who was an anthropologist and an explorer. In the 1930s, he wrote a book called The Laughing Boy. It was a story of a Navajo love story, won the Pulitzer Prize. This is a gun he carried on his expeditions. There's a letter from the family telling about the gun and the history.
Wow.
Again, made in the late 1920s. Okay.
Sounds like real life Indiana Jones.
Yes, real life Indiana Jones. That's true. After at the start of World War II, Colt discontinued production of the Colt single action. The returning vets from World War II were the largest group of gun collectors there ever was. They really appreciated firearms. So by 1955, there was a great demand again for Colt single actions. So Colt brought the single action out again in 1955. It's called a second generation. All the parts are interchangeable with the first generation guns. The only difference is the way the serial number was. It says S.A. at the end of the serial number. That continues up to about 70,000. So like I say, all the parts are interchangeable. These are quite collectible today, very popular, made in many different calibers. And then after 1976, Colt made a manufacturing change in the Colt single action. They went to what's called the third generation. The biggest difference is some of the parts are not interchangeable. The frames were cast instead of forged, but the guns look the same. And they made these guns up until the late 1980s. They have different kinds of markings on. They could say S.A. after the serial number, S.A. before the serial number, S before A after. Okay, this is the last of the Colt single actions. Going back to the Colt Bisley, 1895, developed as a target pistol. They also made single actions in this style as target pistols, maybe only 1,000 guns total of the two times. The second generation Colt came out with again a target style pistol. This one's a kind of scarce gun because of the shorter barrel and a 44 special caliber. Second generation. Yet third generation still being made. The last ones made, again, target pistols made. The only difference is the frames were cast. Some of the parts are not slightly interchangeable.
Why is that?
It was a manufacturing change.
Okay.
It was strictly an economic thing.
So they made them easier to manufacture, cheaper?
Cheaper for them to manufacture.
Okay.
The Colt single action never became inexpensive, though. The Uberti started developing the gun in Italy as a replica, relatively inexpensive, a third the cost of a Colt pistol at the time. And They're still being made today. The Colt factory presented guns to famous people starting with the early single actions in the 1880s and continued all the way up until they could discontinue the gun. This gun was presented by the Colt factory and the Bull and Leather Company in Hollywood to Ben Johnson, who was a famous movie actor, cowboy actor, who won an Oscar for his role in The Last Picture Show.
Boy, ain't that pretty.
Got an inscription on the backstrap to Ben Johnson from Colt Firearms and from Bull and Leather. So the gun is a factory engraved Colt Single Action, ivory grips, and special leather holster with his initials in gold on the buckle, presented to Ben Johnson. So the Colt factory, even up until in the 1980s, was still making presentations.
Wow.
And there are still opportunities today for you to find guns. You can write a letter to the Colt factory, and probably 85% of the time they can come up with a history of where the gun was shipped to and whether it was factory engraved or something.
Wow.
Years ago, a man bought a gun, just a nickel-plated Colt Single Action at a gun show, sent in a letter. The gun was shipped directly to Bat Masterson.
Wow.
So there is opportunities to find really historical things.
Yeah, man, that's incredible. Well, thank you for taking the time to show us all this.
Okay.
I really appreciate it.
Okay, very good.
Excellent. All right, guys, that was an incredible collection of single action armies. Let me know in the comments below which one is your favorite. Personally, I like the lamb chop, pearl handled, engraved single action army because I am a man of style. I just want to thank Mr. Peterson for showing me his incredible collection. Hopefully we can work together more in the future. If you guys are interested in that stuff, let me know. Like this video, subscribe to TFB, and I will see you on the range, partner.